All right. Well, now I'd like to welcome to the show Jarrett Dieterle, resident senior fellow at the R Street Institute, where his research focuses on food and beverage policy, among other issues. Welcome to Free the Economy, Jarrett.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So recently you wrote that, few voters today focus on alcohol policy as the most important issue in federal elections. Nevertheless, this year's most recent presidential race, uh, might be one of the most significant ones for policy related to beverages and alcohol since the repeal of prohibition almost a century ago. And so you recently wrote a great article that I really loved about re recapping some of those angles that have to do with drinks and alcohol. And so let's go through a few of those. And I think there's one that maybe obvious to people, maybe not be obvious. What do tariffs on steel and aluminum have to do with the alcohol beverage industry?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, obviously the containers that we put our beverages in are often cans and are aluminum. Yeah, exactly. And so therefore it's not hard to see that if you raise the price of aluminum, you're going to raise the price of ultimately what a can of beer costs. And so that was a huge drama that unfolded in the first iteration of the Trump administration. And so I think the industry is kind of girding itself for potentially going through that again. And yeah, so it's people tend to with tariffs tend to focus on like is the product itself subject to a tariff, but you also have to look at obviously our inputs that go into the product. Do they have tariffs? Does the packaging that it's in have tariffs? And so it certainly does, with aluminum, and that's a big hobby horse for the former and future president, I guess we could say. So,
Well, yeah, and it seems like for if you look into sort of the subset of the say like the beer industry, the more expensive kind of specialty beers would probably be more likely in glass bottles, and there would be more because they're more premium product, they might end up having more margin. But if you have something like Bud Miller Coors, the the margin's pretty small, the market's even more competitive, and so even a small change in the price of one of the major inputs seems like it could have kind of an outsize impact.
to your point, like yes, it impacts the macros where they have tighter, um, probably margins of like price point sensitivity. But also, it's more and more really impacting the smaller guys as the beer market diversifies and a lot more different types of beer are being made. There's been a shift, or at least a diversification of the type of containers they're going in. It's not the craft beer industry of like the 90s, early 2000s, which was almost entirely bottle, really. So,
Well, yeah, so the beer guys have had to deal with higher costs, but apparently the whiskey folks have also been having their own problems. And so there's one recent article quotes a distillery manager from Virginia as saying that trade disputes with Europe during the first Trump administration basically killed their export market for the domestic whiskey makers and spirits makers trying to get into the EU. What's the status of that now?
yeah, so there's been somewhat of a de-escalation in the whiskey wars, if you want to call them that. I mean, the EU retaliated as countries always do when there's tariffs to the different tariffs that the Trump administration implemented, including the aluminum. So they retaliated on things like American bourbon and other American whiskeys. The bourbon boom or bourbon bubble has really been taking off and is becoming increasingly worldwide. And the place that makes the best bourbons is obviously in America. And so the EU market's actually been pretty much the most important export market for American whiskey. So yeah, they get slapped with tariffs, that market dries up. I mean, I remember talking even to craft distillers that had just made like investments in trying to make a play in Europe, and then all of a sudden, like the tariffs came down, and ended up being wasted and drying up. And then America then responds with further escalation. This is what you can run into at tariffs, this kind of increasing escalation. They put tariffs on Scotch and Irish whiskey and other European liqueurs that have there's a lot that have become very popular in the craft cocktail movement. They were being imported here, so it just ended up kind of this little bit of a circular firing squad where each side was going at ultimately drying up a very important market for the producers on the other side of the pond, essentially.
So one thing I thought here was really funny, which I've sort of heard in other examples of trade disputes, is that when uh, one side or the other, one country or another, picks which product they want to slap a tariff on, they don't necessarily do it for big macroeconomic reasons. They do it for sort of like culturally specific to get your attention reasons. So there was a case just we talked about it I think, a couple episodes ago where trade dispute between the EU and China, and EU doesn't want cheap Chinese electric vehicles coming in, and so they put tariffs on them. And within the EU, France supposedly was really pro, putting tariffs on Chinese vehicles. And so the Chinese, having heard that, decided to put a tariff on French cognac, right? So cognac is not a large part of the GDP of France or the EU, but it's a symbolically important thing for France, right? And so I really thought it was fascinating this suggestion in one of these articles that that the sort of like American whiskey or bourbon tariff was chosen specifically to get the attention of Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, as a senator from
Yeah.
Kentucky, where so many great American whiskeys are made.
No, that's 100%, I think, accurate. Um, and yeah, and I think not only the political leadership factor, but also bourbon is kind of increasingly become a in capitalism and exporting. It's not just Nike,
Mhm.
Nike anymore. The bourbon has gotten a cachet to it. It could be a status symbol for well educated drinkers, and the prices of it have escalated quite a bit. It's not quite like Scotch overall yet, but the bourbon bubble. I mean, there's been crazy stories about how much bourbon collectors collecting very. So yeah, I think it's ultimately also just that status symbol of like you think of America, and that is one of the things that you think of as far as like a culinary export from America. So yeah, I think you're totally right. It's definitely going after the symbols to make the kind of biggest statement.
Yeah, everyone wants that old bottle of Pappy Van Winkle. I gotta have it on the shelf. So,
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
so again, during the recent campaign, uh, there's an interesting case where the Harris campaign tried, lots of different angles against Trump, appealing to different sort of constituencies, and one of them I thought was interesting. The Harris campaign warning younger voters that that Trump tariffs would, you know, the tariffs that Trump talked about would hit all sorts of products, increasing their price, um, but that they specifically targeted messaging about drinks and imported alcohol, what they called the Trump tequila tax, right? It would probably, I mean, be the Trump import tax on everything, but that they sort of like pointed that out to presumably younger, more party-minded voters, worried that their tequila, their Modelo, their whatever, um, would get hit by that, and that would be a buzzkill. Um, from what like the Trump campaign has said about tariffs, do we think they would disproportionately hit the beverage industry, or are we just thinking that 10% across the board tariffs would just hit everything? Or I guess the one other angle that I've heard specifically are one from China and from Mexico. I don't know how much we import alcoholic beverages from China, but if Trump were trying to put pressure on Mexico over immigration status, and one of the things he specifically said is that he would have tariffs on Mexico if they sort of didn't play ball on immigration reform or what his version of immigration policy, what you want to call the reform or not. Then I guess that could end up being a Trump tequila tax.
Yeah, I mean mezcal, tequila. Mexican lagers, could be a real dry spell for them. But yeah, in all seriousness, like yeah, I don't know if it will start with those products necessarily being targeted. Like, for example, it wasn't the first thing that the first iteration of the Trump administration went after was Scotch and Irish whiskey. It got to that point after this increasing escalation. So I would imagine that it could take that form maybe. And then to your point, certainly the status thing. I mean, the tequila, like a lot of spirits, is booming, and it's become extremely very even high end tequilas have become extremely popular in the United States. There's been celebrities that have started, investing in tequila companies, and so it definitely would fall in that category of something that would catch people's attention, even beyond just the party crowd that obviously is out there. I don't know how much the party crowd thing, like, it probably those drinkers are most willing to like substitute like vodka and like other stuff for it, but there certainly will be the high end tequila drinkers that are not. So yeah, I think that it will be used as a specific weapon to apply pressure, probably on both sides. I don't know if it'll start there. It may start as kind of some of these across the board things. But, and then I think just like the last thing I'd mention is that I think export markets are particularly important. They're important for every market, obviously, but particularly in alcohol, because of the way that we like to, in the food category in particular, try different things and tastes, and those tend to have some kind of a regional tie. It's why we like French wine, right? French cognac, as you mentioned earlier. They tend to have a lot of heritage and history that is heavily based in a certain geographic region. And so, yeah, there's more American craft distillers making tequila now, but it's, probably never going to be exactly the same as the hundreds of years of culture in Mexico. So I think that's another important factor in the spirits industry specifically.
Oh yeah. And well, and speaking of the connection to immigration, moving into the wine realm, we're also looking at the possibility that if the Trump administration has a more restrictive immigration policy, that could have repercussions in, say, California and the wine industry, where a lot of people that work in wineries are immigrant labor or migrant labor from Mexico. Immigrant and migrant labor from Mexico and Latin America has obviously been a big part of California's agriculture industry in general for a long time. Um, but how much of an impact do you think is there sort of a disparate impact among wine growers versus almond growers and artichoke growers and lettuce people?
Yeah, yeah, lettuce people. I like that. Yeah, that's a good question. I have not actually broken down that specifically wine versus the other agricultural components. I do know, however, that wine in particular has been going through a real struggle, probably more so than some of those other products that you mentioned, and I think it may impact them more. We've seen a lot of that with, we'll get into probably some of this, but the dietary guideline, like health discussion around alcohol, which wine tends to be at the forefront of that, given the so-called French paradox, which we'll probably get into. And then also there's been a lot of there's been new regulations on organic wines and what can get imported, and the USDA has upped the hoops that need to be jumped through. So that's led to less wines being able to display organic. Certainly, the tariff concerns that are kind of upcoming, and then also just the fierce competition right now in the alcohol industry. Consumers, it's not our mom and dad and grandfather's world of drinking, where it was kind of like the prototypical, like, like husband drank like his macro lagers, and like the wife, like, drank like the wines, like that gendered stereotype. I mean, all Americans, and increasingly the younger ages are drinking across all categories of spirits and drinks. And so that means that wine has lost some market share because they haven't had the demand for it. And so I think it will hit them particularly hard because they can't really afford to be hit very hard right now, the way the global wine markets are. So,
Well, and I've heard that there's sort of, you know, as you sort of talked about the shifting cultural affinities that the baby boomers were really big on sort of like the status of the fancy bottle of red wine with their steak dinner, and that kind of that enthusiasm doesn't necessarily trickle down to the younger generations where it's not quite as much the sign that you've like made it, right? That you have the like, $500 bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon from Napa Valley.
yeah. Yep. No, absolutely. I think if anything, it's probably that you have the $300, aged, rare bourbon maybe or something, or scotch really. I think that it's probably gone more in that direction. And, they've studied a lot of like how younger, millennial generation, and below consumers are, drinking. And, you're much more likely to see situation like, a couple going out and starting the night with getting maybe late afternoon, getting a couple beers with friends, going to a restaurant, maybe like having a pre-dinner cocktail, and then getting wine with dinner. And that just like wasn't a thing that like really happened, even like as recently as a decade or two ago. Usually people again stuck to their category. Wine obviously was very predominant, like the food space, as you mentioned. People want that wine with dinner, but it's all over the map now. And there's beer pairings, and spirit pairings, and all different kinds of things. So there's a lot less brand loyalty too. So it's just made for a much more competitive market. And then when you have a lot of government rules that compound the problem, make it harder to get access to market, which is happening both internationally and domestically with alcohol. Then yeah, you're gonna hurt any industry, and then you give them a labor supply shock with drying up a source of labor wherever you come out on the immigration question, and you're going to create a whole host of potential issues.
Well, yeah, and so you've already kind of led into this, which another aspect of this, sort of at the federal level, which is kind of fascinating, is what do the federal sort of public health agencies have to say about alcohol, right? So you talked about, the so-called French paradox that French people have, they drink more alcohol, but they have like lower incidence of, heart disease and things like that, and has led a lot of researchers to say that maybe wine, or sometimes specifically red wine, has some effect that wards off heart disease, or that counteracts whatever negative effects might be from the alcohol itself. Um, and there's a lot of like research has been done over that over the past, several years. Um, but the guidance from public health experts, right? The, CDC, NIH, those kind of people, um, generally is pretty blunt, right? So if a public health administrator is giving a advice on what to do, what to eat or drink, or not to eat or not to drink, usually they don't want to give a 3 paragraph long disquisition on, well, the current state of the peer-reviewed science is that sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. Usually, when you have those suggestions, they're like, eat this, don't eat that, avoid that, minimize this. And so there's been this sort of fight between the people. In my reading of it, I'll be interested what you have to say, is that there's for a long time there has been the guidance that says, mm, you know, low to moderate drinking of alcohol on occasion is fine and can be part of a healthy lifestyle. Just don't binge drink. That's not good for you. Um, where there's now a sort of more Puritan strain of the public health experts, where they want to say there's no amount of alcohol, one drink a month. That's not good. That's too much. That it's like alcohol is just poison, and the least amount possible is the only best way to go. And they're obviously which of those two messages Americans hear, right, um, is going to have a big, impact. And so where are we now, at least in the United States, right? So when it comes to like other things like say tobacco or other things, there's sort of difference between what our public health people here in the US are doing and what say like the World Health Organization or the UN or something does. So sometimes there's a conflict there. But where are we in the fight between the moderate alcohol versus no amount is safe debate right now?
Well, we're kind of in that, maybe the cavalry skirmish, that's going to lead up to the big battle, if you want
Mhm.
to use a war analogy. It really has, to your point, it's been something that's been bubbling up in Europe for a while now, particularly at the World Health Organization, which in 2003, I believe it was, came out with their declaration that there was no safe level of alcohol for drinking. Um, and Canada went through a big effort to propose revisions to their guidelines, which were ultimately actually rejected. And now the US every 5 years updates its dietary guidelines. Now, are they beholden to the World Health Organization? No, like we have our own guidelines, but that kind of community of scientific pressure certainly can be pretty strong. And so there was actually in the 2000 guidelines a push to reduce the drinking, not quite as much now, but to reduce the drinking guidelines. And that was ultimately rejected under the first Trump administration. And so now, 5 years later, we're back here, and it is looking, the tea leaves seem to be reading that there could be a declaration of potentially even echoing that World Health Organization no safe level of alcohol being conducive to a healthy lifestyle. And that will create massive shockwaves through American culture and also through the alcohol industry. It will probably, for example, provide a lot of fodder for class action lawsuits like we saw with big tobacco. And so the issue to your point is essentially not to like oversimplify it, but is alcohol good or bad for you? And there was a long time view, sometimes been called the French paradox. Like, why are French people on average healthier than Americans? There was a 60-minute episode several decades ago, and there was some theory that their Mediterranean style, a Mediterranean style diet and wine could increase longevity of life. But essentially, long story short, now we're fast forwarding a couple of decades, and there's been a lot of pushback. There's been a lot of claims that J curve or that assumption that moderate alcohol is healthy has been debunked, and that the debate's over, and alcohol's bad. Period. And my personal take on it is that the whatever you want, wherever you come out on it, ultimately, it is very far from settled, and to portray it as this, done deal, sealed, open shut case, just is not where the science has been. There is still studies coming out that support the J curve. There's also studies that have shown, potential links and correlations with different forms of cancer and alcohol. So very up in the air, and I guess it depends on your posture. Being the free marketer and the libertarian I am, like when in doubt, usually that's a reason for regulatory caution, in my opinion. But the other side of that, as we well know, there is some people that, when in doubt, government action. So
Mhm.
I think that that's kind of where we sit with it right now, and we're going to see where these guidelines come out. Will they be impacted by the second term of Trump versus the Biden administration? Maybe, we don't know. Right before this, I was researching, trying to figure out how RFK might impact all this, like with his nomination to HHS. I mean, it's all a wild card right now. We have no idea, so it's stay tuned.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would also say that even if there was you know, less of a link than we might have thought to the positive effects of moderate alcohol consumption, that that's not a license to say that alcohol should be restricted by the government or that, uh, there should be some sort of, force of government to stop people from drinking. I'm sure the World Health Organization would also claim that there was no safe level of motorcycle riding. in the world, but we still let people ride motorcycles despite the fact that we everyone knows it's dangerous. Um, that's my editorial
Yes.
comment inserted there. Um, so there's a court case from earlier this year that I thought was interesting that I was interested to see what you thought about. That's the Hobby Distillers Association versus the Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau. Um, so this kind of reflects 40 plus years later, the regulations about home beer brewing, where it used to be illegal to brew your own beer at home, and then around like 1980 or so, somewhere around there, they sort of changed those rules, and it became basically legal to brew your own beer at home. And that's kind of coincided with the explosion of like the craft brew revolution in the United States, and lots of people went from being hobbyists to being small startup brewers, and now we've got, I'm from Portland, Oregon, which is kind of the home the home point of craft brewing, and then spread across the country. And now we have every every hipster town in America has 30 craft breweries on Main Street. And so just this year we have this like legal challenge where these people who want to be able to like distill, make their own gin and tequila and things at home, have their like hobby distilleries. Um, are suing the government saying you can't, the government said you can't do that at all under any circumstances, not allowed. But now it looks like maybe they will be able to.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that that's a CEI case. I
Mm.
gotta give you all recognition for that for sure. And there's actually a couple pending cases. There's another one, Ream versus U.S. Treasury from the Buckeye Institute. So yeah, it's become like a big. It's funny. I started writing about this from a policy perspective about banning home distilling. Gosh, I can't remember. It's been several years ago now, and never really thought about it from a legal perspective, which is and I don't love the way that the modern commerce clause has been stretched. But yeah, I think it's really quite a brilliantly creative and important case on both the legal principles and the policy implications of it, or what it means for distillers. I mean, just I don't hold myself out as like a constitutional law professor, but I do think that the Raich case that with the home growing of marijuana, certainly something that's been needed to be revisited, which I think a lot of libertarian legal scholars are on board with. Everyone, not everyone, many people in the libertarian community dislike, the Wickard case and homegrown consumption of wheat. So alcohol fits right in with that. And there's just really not a good, colorable reason why it's needed to have a federal law that bans, distilling. We allow brewing, allow winemaking, and then yeah, I mean policy wise too, like um, we already allow all this different types of alcohol to be made. I've heard some arguments. I was even once kind of yelled at by a master distiller of a very prominent bourbon brand about the concept of home distilling out of concerns of safety that create fires or explosions. And I mean, I tend to be in favor of looking at the evidence on that. New Zealand's legalized home distilling for over a decade now, I think, and I've spent too long combing through their statistics on any incidences of fires or deaths or injuries from home distilling, and it's been zero that I can find. I can't find one incident of it, and they do actually keep track of that in New Zealand. Yeah, I don't know. It's been a very fascinating thing to watch develop legally. I am like really focused on and curious on where these cases go, and yeah, it's kind of like a win-win, at least from a libertarian perspective, because it could free some personal liberty for people, but then also could have huge constitutional ramifications. So,
Yeah, I mean that is so that'll be exciting to follow in the future. And to to wrap this all up, I think we've talked about, which was the original premise, the like the federal level stuff that having to do with alcohol policy, and how the most recent election might, you know now that we have a decision, affect that one way or the other. But of course, a lot of alcohol policy and regulation takes place at the state level, right? Every state has its own laws and regulations, and some states' systems are very different than others. Um, and as a lot of people will know, we've got some of the states that have like really tight control over alcohol. We'll call the control states, right, where they sort of own the liquor stores and operate them in a way that the state governments don't do with almost anything else, right? Any other product. Um, so I wonder if you just quickly, if there are any big trends there, because I know it's been it's been a while now. In the back of my mind, I was thinking, oh, this didn't happen that long ago, but it happened a long time ago. Like Washington State changed from being a control state to being a state where you can buy alcohol in supermarkets. So it doesn't happen that often that a state changes a system, but it's always possible. And I wonder if you see any overall trends. Do you think states in general are tending towards better alcohol policy or worse alcohol policy?
Yeah, and I think it's going to be. I don't know how many more like big, kind of systemic reforms like Washington State, we'll see or not. But I do think there's been a lot of kind of, if not, deregulatory touchdowns, deregulatory first downs. There's been progress in moving the ball down the field. I mean, certainly, the COVID to go cocktail stuff was well covered by you all too. I know you guys did work on that, and that obviously was an advance. But we're seeing now a lot more in the like nuts and bolts of how alcohol is delivered, how it's regulated when it's delivered, more in like the what's known as direct to consumer, which is basically just a fancy way of saying that your bourbon producers or your beer brewers can ship directly to consumers, like wine has done for years. We're seeing more interest in that and more of a push for that. We're seeing more, efforts to find ways around the three-tier system or to like have self-distribution, so you don't always have to go through the three-tier system if you're a brewer or distiller. So yeah, to answer your question, there's definitely been a move towards that. At the same time, I think that it's I do think that there are concerning headwinds. It's never always black and white. I think that as governments get more revenue starved, alcohol's often very unfortunately popular thing among politicians to tax is a little bit usually less noticeable to the average consumer than like their property tax bill or like income tax bill that comes in the mail. Chicago's mayor just proposed a 34% increase on alcohol tax, and who will that hurt? Right, the mom and pop alcohol stores is who it will hurt most. And so I think that local governments, state governments, that's a concern. And I think that that is even could potentially become even more of a concern just to really tie all this together if there is a revision in the guidelines that alcohol is deemed not safe, a big push to raise taxes on it. And so John Marshall said the power to tax is the power to destroy, right? So I think that there's a reason for optimism, but there's also some things that I think need to be paid attention to that could be on the horizon. So
All right. And well, I guess one more lightning round, which you kind of hinted at there for a second, which is you know, President-elect Trump has nominated Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be Secretary of Health and Human Services. And HHS Secretary is a huge job, and the secretary is in charge of lots of things and lots of large budgets and policy setting. Uh, what do you think would happen if Kennedy is confirmed to that post? We know Trump is not a drinker. I believe Kennedy is. Not sure how much that will sway things either way. But he is certainly a wild card when it comes to the world of public health. Not your usual public health bureaucrat. Any guesses there?
Yeah, well, no, I mean, not really. I was just reading. Apparently, he is in recovery for alcohol addiction. He's actually
Hmm.
talked about, maybe jokingly, maybe seriously, hosting AA meetings in the White House. But at the same time, that might make you think that, be really anti-alcohol. But it's just all over the place. Like a big proponent of like the raw milk, which has been like a libertarian cause célèbre for like a long time on the food front. Also, the HHS is one of the two agencies that overlooks those guidelines, and he has definitely been no fan of a lot of the FDA, which is the other agency, a lot of their guidance on food. So he could be this wrench thrown into the machine that kind of blows up that whole process. It may not even be his hobby horse alcohol, but it might be something that happens alongside with a greater relooking at things. And there's always the question, it's easy to say things to the press, but the bureaucratic system, unfortunately, is so complex, right? Like how much of this is going to be able to change in a 4-year administration, sans congressional action, or even with congressional action. So I don't know. I would be in a far more important position, I think, if I knew the answer to that. But I do think that will be interesting. So
All right. Well, Jarrett, thank you so much for being with us. And before we go, tell everyone where they can find all your material online.
yeah, no, I appreciate y'all having me. You guys do great work on these topics. But yeah, rstreet.org. And I write pretty much like weekly for Reason magazine on all these types of food and beverage issues. So you can catch me there. I appreciate y'all.
All right. Fantastic. Thanks again for being with us, Jarrett.
Thank you.